Well, welcome everyone. My name is Alexa and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining us for Building Confidence in Your Automation with Jeff Payne and Max Saperstone. First, I would like to go over some of the features in Adobe Connect that you can use during today's web seminar. If you have not done so already, you can download a copy of the seminar materials from the resources section on the right side of your screen. All comments posted in chat are visible to everyone by default, but if you experience any sort of technical difficulty and need assistance, in the upper right-hand corner of the chat panel, select Start Chat With, and then my name, Alexa Angel, to begin a private chat, and I can help you immediately. You can also use the status menu, which is located next to the main menu navigation at the top of your screen, to show agreement, ask the speaker to speak louder, or share some applause.
Thanks, Alexa. Good day, everyone. Confidence in your automation. My name is Jeff Payne. I'll be the host and moderator for this event today. So those of you that don't know me, I've been building and testing software for many decades now. Have run a couple of software companies, including Coveros, and am currently also the technical editor for the Agile Connection community. If you're not a member of Agile Connection, you're interested in Agile, most definitely would encourage you to join in. I have a special guest here today who's going to be giving a version of the keynote that he gave at the Star West conference earlier this fall, but we've reoriented it so we can have some discussion around some of the key points as well. So let me turn it over and let Max introduce himself. Max?
All right, great. Thanks, Jeff. So yeah, as Jeff and Angela gave me an introduction, my name is Max Saperstone. I'm actually the Director of Test and Automation over at Coveros. I have been doing test automation for over a decade. I kind of fell into it because, well, honestly, I'm lazy, and I thought there was a better, easier way for me to get a lot of stuff done. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing over the past 10 years has been centered around writing automation, designing automation frameworks, really overall just acting as a test architect. Over the years, I've worked with probably almost 15 different companies between my experience at Coveros and elsewhere. And a lot of that has really been allowed me to see a lot, well, unfortunately, of bad ways that test automation has been done. And, you know, I've also been able to see some good ways that it can actually be used as well, and some great things that we can actually do with it as a result. And so one of the, the big things that I keep coming back to that I've seen multiple times is really the idea of test automation and it not working. I don't know how familiar you guys are with hearing this, but what I hear over and over again is, oh yeah, test automation is great, but it doesn't work. And quite honestly, a lot of what I've seen is, you're right, test automation doesn't work the way that you're doing it or what it is that you're actually looking at. So what I really wanted to talk about a bit today, since I get the pleasure of getting to talk to you guys for a bit of time, is how you can actually do test automation right. And not just how you can do it right, but so that everyone on your team, everyone within your project, everyone within the company can have the same confidence of knowing that when you say your automation tests X, that everyone knows that it does in fact test X, that your team knows that it does X and only X, so that they don't even have to do X, worth amount of work, and therefore save yourself some amount of time. And the big thing, that I continuously, think about and that I hear when we're talking about test automation is this, most recently, this growing thought, this growing trend that test automation isn't testing. And this is by no means a new concept. I have heard this from James Bach, I think, quite a while ago, and I actually really like the way that he puts it, the idea that test automation are checks. But it's been growing more and more in this space. And so I just have some wonderful links I've thrown up here for you guys. This is by no means an exhaustive list of anything, but if you want to do some reading about why test automation isn't testing, here's some fantastic resources for you. But when I first heard about it, I kind of blew off this topic, kind of blew off this idea, because I was like, no, I'm a tester and I do automation. Doesn't mean what I'm not doing isn't testing. And eventually I started doing some more reading about this, and kind of what I found is that, yeah, there is actually a lot of backing. There is really a lot of movement and credibility behind this idea about test automation not really being testing. And really the whole concept, the whole idea behind it is the fact that in reality our automation is doing pre-examined and predefined things. It's not checking the system as a whole. And that's a really important thing to point out, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to start off talking about test automation being testing versus checking, is because that is a big thing, and I think a large gap in the space of why people don't trust test automation and why they say test automation doesn't work. It's because a lot of people try and push test automation to this higher up level, saying that it is a fully comprehensive examination of the system, when sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And so we just want to be very clear when we're doing test automation to define, well, what is it that we're actually looking at? Because, again, we're not looking at the system as a whole, and that's what testing is. Testing is getting a large understanding of the system, how everything plays together, whereas our automation is really just checking individual parts. And so, again, in order to properly understand, in order to properly get a good feel of how it is test automation can help and what it is test automation can do for us, we really want to make sure that we are properly presenting test automation in the right way. And again, in my mind, that really is a lot more about checking than it is actually about testing. The big answer, that I came up, or excuse me, the big question that I came up with is after reading all these articles, going back and looking at a lot of work, talking with additional people is, well, what does that actually mean for test automation? Does that mean that we're wasting our time? Does that mean that maybe we're not getting the ROI that we're actually expecting as a result? And in my mind, I mean, of course, there's still definitely a large space for test automation. There are people who preach automation all the way from, 100%, everything should be automated, there's no more need for manual testers, let's fire those guys, to people who say, well, test automation is never going to work, I don't trust it, I don't want to do any of this. And I fall somewhere fairly nicely in the middle. Depending on the actual project, I'd say, I'd be a proponent of anywhere between 50 and 90% of the application that should be automated. But again, it really depends on what it is you're doing. So one of the things that I always like to ask people when we think about it is really, where is the space for automation? I'm going to ask this out, more of a rhetorical question just because it's a webinar. But think to yourself, how much of your application is actually automated? Do you have 10% of your application automated? Do you have 50% of your application automated? Do you think you have 100% of your application automated? So to those of you who say, 100% automated, that's great, that's fantastic. You guys are in the minority. That's definitely not typically what we see. As far as industry standards, the best that I've actually been able to come up with from my reading, from my asking around, what I found is that somewhere actually right around 20% industry standard is testing that's actually done with automation. So, again, think about what you were just talking about, what the number you just had in your head, and how do you actually compare with that number? Are you ahead or are you above? And then before you, pat yourself on the back or worry that you're falling a little bit behind on the times, my next question for you is, well, do you actually find that you save that much time on your manual testing? So, for example, if you say that you have 100% of your application automated, does that mean that you no longer do any testing, that 100% of your testing is done through automation? What I found is the answer is no. So my question is, well, then do you really have 100% automation? The answer might be yes, but does that mean that you have done 100% of your testing? And, if you're doing any sort of manual testing, again, it means no, which is, again, going back to this, automation is doing checking. It's not really doing testing, which is, again, fine, because there's still a huge space and a huge need for this automation that comes in there. And a big portion of this is because, as most testers will tell you, testing is something that's cumulative. It's not something that you can just set and forget. You can just write and run and not worry about it anymore. One of the big issues that I often hear in the Agile space, and again, I do a lot with the Agile testing transformations and Agile testing groups as well, is the idea of when you're doing Agile testing properly, you should be starting testing at the very beginning of sprint, at least some of those activities. What you don't want is the last 2 days, the last day, or even worse, that last weekend, to have the application thrown over the wall and for you to spend all of your time testing on it. I mean, what we always hear is, well, we don't have enough time to run all of our tests. And a lot of that, what I hear, is pushback because of, well, we're not doing Agile properly. We haven't gotten the test We haven't gotten the information quick enough, so we're not actually able to do all the testing. But I actually say that's only part of the problem. The larger problem is when the developer does, an amount of testing, amount of development for A, I have to test all of A. The developer then has to do the same amount of work, say, for component B. I, however, have to test B, and I have to test A to make sure that nothing else got broke. When they then do C, I have to test C, make sure they didn't break B, make sure they didn't break A. And so this testing is this cumulative, this building effort. And if we didn't have automation in order to free up some of our time, no way that we would ever be able to keep up with this additional work, because the developer's set of work is not growing. And as testers, we do have that. So even if we have 100% of our application automated, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be running manual tests. Even if we are a sprint behind, doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing automation, because that's the only way we're ever going to be able to get good coverage and full coverage of our application, especially when we're talking about our regression tests. So again, why am I talking about this when really the whole goal is to talk about building confidence, making sure that we actually know that our tests are doing what they're supposed to. And that's because the very first step, what you really want to be thinking about for this idea, is to make sure that you're testing the appropriate thing, and that what you say you're testing, you actually are. Because again, if we write bad, if we write wrong tests, clearly, of course, we can't have confidence in them. But even lower than that, we need to, before we even do that, we have to make sure that we're testing the appropriate thing. A lot of times we don't have confidence in our tests because they're brittle, they're complex, they change frequently, so of course you can't trust them. But really what we need to make sure is that we're testing at the right level and that we're being very clear as to what it is that we're actually testing. We're communicating that properly. So again, the goal is to identify our core verification points, automate those, and expand from there. A lot of times it's doing a breadth versus depth testing strategy, very similar to what you might actually be doing with your risk-based testing, and then conforming those into our automation. So again, look at the complex areas, look at the workflows, look at the things that are really complicated. Because it's really easy to automate a lot of our individual components and our individual features, and that's really where we want to be starting with these things, but being clear that that's exactly what it is that we're actually testing. So let's take, for example, our lovely Coveros website. It's a relatively simple page. It's built on WordPress. It's nothing super fancy or fantastic. And let's say that I said that I have gone through and I've written some automated tests for this. And I only have so much time, but I can say, sure, I'm checking that I have all of those links that I expected. I have products, that I have services, I have training, I have thought leadership, I have the About Us, that I have the Agility Security Delivered, that title is actually there, and that I have the tagline there. And maybe even I want to make sure that the logo's there. That seems like a fairly well set of tests that I can say, hey, I verified the homepage. I have automated tests, and I know that the homepage is working properly. Problem is, as soon as I say that, as soon as I start getting into that area, I have let a false sense of security actually get in there. I mean, have I written a test to make sure that the image actually loaded properly? Because if that image doesn't exist on the server, it's a much harder lift for me in order to make sure that it actually is in fact there. Something that's visual. I don't know how much time it's really going to take for me to do that. What if I have text that's overlapping? Well, I might have messed up my spacing. I might have done something else that's potentially painful to my application. Do I have an automated test that's going to look for that? Maybe, maybe not. I can spend a lot of time trying to figure this out. But I can do it manually, just like that, just by looking at this page. Again, I'm looking at the system as a whole, whereas my automation is looking at these individual components, and it's going to be very painful to get through. Things like checking, is the logo the appropriate size? Are things the appropriate color? Is even the image that I expect? All things that are really painful to automate, but very, very easy to do when you're doing some manual tests. And the problem that we actually run into is, well, I just said that I've tested the homepage, but literally every single change that I just showed you guys in these last few slides that we looked at are one-word changes that I was able to introduce, meaning I could have one typo and completely break the main page. Very easy thing to get done. But as soon as I've told my boss that I have properly tested our page and he finds any of these issues, you know that it's going to be coming back down on me. He's going to say, well, why didn't you catch this? Why didn't you catch that? Why didn't you catch this? And I'm going to say, well, let's be clear. Those are usability issues. Or, oh, those are image things. That's really out of scope. And so, unfortunately, what I've just done is I have made the mistake of saying that I have tested a lot more than I really have. That I have actually that I'm overexpressing the amount of coverage that I actually have with my automated tests, which means that, again, I have given a false sense of confidence to the actual site. And if I give a false sense of confidence, well, then no one's going to trust my tests. This is just about me not properly identifying what it is that I'm looking for. What it is that I'm looking at. And I'm not trying to say let's not automate anything. What I'm trying to say is let's be very smart with what it is that we are automating, because some of these things might be really difficult to automate. It might be a lot of time. There might be a very bad ROI. But let's make sure that we're not overselling what our automation is actually doing, because as soon as I say that, every single one of my tests may potentially be suspect. Well, are you really automating all this? Or, are you giving me this false sense of security? And that is why a lot of these comments rise about why automation doesn't work and why are we wasting our time with it. It's because we're overselling it. We're not being very clear and being very poignant with exactly what it is that we're trying to test. And in my mind, that's not the point of automation. The point of automation is not to be exhaustive and look at every single usability and capability out there. It's to make sure that we can get the workflows, that we can get the overall features and the overall items automated properly. Then we can start diving into a lot of these details that may not provide us the same sort of value. Because it's a lot more important if this text isn't there, if these links aren't there, than it is about what is the color. And so I can identify all these things in half a second, and it may take me a month to automate them. So let's just, again, be very careful and cautious about what it is that we're actually looking at. So with that, I think, Jeff, you wanted to kind of have a little bit of a discussion about testing versus checking and really talking a little bit more about the difference and where it is that we lie within this.
Yeah, I do. Excellent. Thanks, Max. So a couple questions for you. I'll be honest, I am not a fan of using the word checking, right? And you know that, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I've read all the papers too. And there's just some fundamental problems with this, right? So first of all, you and I agree philosophically, automation is not the answer. 100% automation isn't the solution, right? You and I both agree the answer is somewhere in the middle, context specific, all that stuff, right? We agree with that. What I want to talk about is this whole idea of calling automated testing automated checking. All right. So your examples were very interesting. And to your point, they were good examples of the concept of the difference between testing and looking at something holistically and checking at the system level. Now, you define testing. I think you said, Max, testing is looking at the system as a whole. So does that mean you don't consider unit testing testing? Is that unit checking? Is API testing now API checking? How do you rationalize or justify some of the lower level types of testing we have to do, or do we not need to call those checking too?
So that is a fantastic question. And quite honestly, what I would probably say is individually, those things are checks. However, no one I shouldn't say nobody, but most of the time people don't write one unit test, and you typically don't write one automation test. You write a set of tests or a set of checks that then focus on an entire system. And as a result, what you have automated tests that, again, look at all these different parts of the system, and when they all add up, yes, then they become a test because they are, in fact, looking at the system, even though individually they're performing checks. I totally agree with you. By calling things checks, you're devaluing the whole idea of automation. It's the exact same way as it pains me and I cringe every time someone goes, oh, well, I've written some scripts in order to verify that. I'm like, well, don't say that. Like, you're really trivializing the whole idea. And I don't know, there's kind of a fine line between it. But as soon as, in my mind, you have multiple checks in there, then you're starting to look at the system as a whole. And so then, yeah, they really are tests. And again, I would put that at any sort of level, whether they're at your API, whether you're at the unit level, or whether you're at your system level integration, et cetera. In my mind, the idea is as soon as they all come together and can now start discussing a larger picture, then yeah, then they really do turn into tests. And I'm not advocating going out and talking about my automated checks because that I think you're going to have a lot of issues selling. But I do think that it's important that you express that automation is not as expressive and is not as encompassing as we can do with our full manual tests. And I think just having that distinction in your mind of the understanding the difference between checking and testing can make sure that you are properly communicating out what it is that you're actually verifying versus what it is that's out of scope. The exact same way that when we set up our test strategy, we say this is in scope, this is out of scope. By understanding that really our automated tests are performing predefined checks, you can say, well, therefore, this is in scope, this is out of scope, this is what I am looking at, this is what I'm not looking at.
So I get that. And so you're saying that an individual unit test, you would have to, and under your approach, you would call it a unit check, which I honestly think is silly. But all right, but let's get to your other point, which was a good one. And I think really where the issue lies here is this is about setting expectations, right? Really. And to me,
exactly.
changing the word doesn't set expectations, right? If I go to my boss and I say, hey, I just wanted to let you know, I completely checked the user interface for my homepage and it works. I haven't changed anything about the expectation I set with my boss about what automation does versus doing effective testing. I don't see that the word checking sets any kind of different expectation, because let's face it, if you look at the dictionary, the word test and check, they're synonyms, along with, let's see, what else did I find? Assess, evaluate, inspect, verify. I mean, these words all mean to most people the exact same thing. So to me, it's not about testing versus checking. It's about getting your description of the expectation for the testing you've done, whether it was automated or not, and make sure that's done properly. What do you think of that?
Oh, no, I completely agree with you. And, we have a comment in the chat saying, why are we concerned with semantics? And I agree. It really is semantics. It is much more about setting the appropriate expectation. Yeah. It doesn't matter. Yeah. You're right. If I go to my boss and I say I tested this versus I checked this or I verified it, you're absolutely right. However, to those of us who are concerned with semantics, it helps us internalize, I think, much more than communicating out to anyone else. But the idea of, I know that I'm only looking at a certain subset versus everything. Because when a manual tester says, I tested this main page, they can actually look at all those millions of different things and they'll have an idea, where automation won't. And I'm definitely not saying we need to go around changing all the vocabulary. What I am saying is, I think understanding that there is a difference can help us become better automation testers.
Yep, well, we definitely need to understand the difference. Last question, and then we'll get back into the presentation. So if I write a manual test and not an exploratory test, I sit down, I look at a requirement, maybe it's around a feature, I write a set of test steps, right? And then I check, right, against the feature requirement, whether that test worked or not, and then I run it manually. So I manually execute that test. Do I now have to call that a manual check? Because I didn't look at the entire system, and I didn't look at the entire capability. My check, even at the UI level, was only for that one particular thing because that's the way my test was written. What would we call that in this testing versus checking world?
So I would say, unless you're a terrible tester, and I'm going to jump back a slide right now. Let's say that you have your test, which is you go to your page and you make sure that the products link actually works. So if you click on that, something actually pops down. Now, so you have 2 steps. Navigate to the home page, or 3 steps. Click on the products link, and then go to Selenified. And you're going to make sure that that works. Now, I'm going to go out here on a limb, and I'm going to say you are a terrible tester if you go to this home page and you notice that there are the little hand signals, Spock hand signs, instead of your drop-down arrows, and you say, well, you know what? That's not in scope for my manual test. I'm not going to report a bug. I don't care. I just want to make sure I get to my Selenified homepage. But the manual tester sees it, and they at least can have the option of opening a bug or not. Your automated test, completely blind to it, potentially. Because if you didn't code it in that specific way.
They might be blind to it, too. They might be blind to it.
They might be, but then I'm going to say, again, I'm going to go it out there, and I'm going to say if they're not noticing all these things in the system while they're running through, I'm going to say that they are a bad tester.
Yeah, they're definitely a bad tester. And I think that gets to your point that, automated tests might be bad tests too, right? If you automated a bad test, you got bad results. So that gets back to whether the person who either wrote the manual and executed it, or automated it and executed it, was a good tester or not, right? So that to me is not
Absolutely.
testing versus checking either. That's the quality of the test and the person doing the test. So hey,
Exactly.
we need to keep moving
and
on.
The difference is, sorry, the difference is though, people have testers are looking at every part of the system as they're moving through it. Your automated tests are not. They're only looking at what you tell them to look at, whereas testers should be looking at everything.
Hope, right? You hope. I would argue good automated tests should do that too, but we can move on. We do want to do a poll and see what everybody in the audience thinks. So let me start the poll, and you can decide. Do you think that automation is testing or checking, or both, based on what you've just heard? Where would you in the audience put that? All right, let's broadcast the results. Everybody can see what the votes were. What do you think of the results, Max? What do you think of what you see here?
Well, either we have the right audience or we've changed a lot of people's minds based on what we've just been talking about. It seems like the majority is going towards both. Plurality, actually the majority is going towards both, with a lot of people on checking, very few on testing, and really we haven't swayed one person out there. And I think that's about right. I honestly, would have been very curious as to what people would have said beforehand and afterwards.
That's true.
But I think both is about right. And we're going to talk about, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the next section of how it can be both, and maybe why you even want to avoid it being both in some particular cases, as to how that can actually cause a lot of problems.
Let's do that now, Max. Why don't we jump back to the presentation, and why don't we keep going? Go ahead.
So one of the things that I always like to talk about any single time I talk about test automation is this concept, this way of trying to determine what we want to automate or not, called the Moscow method. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with it or not, but the idea is, what must we automate? What should we automate? What could we automate? What will we not automate? What won't we automate, if you will? And it can be really helpful, when we're thinking back to our prior example of, great, what is our automation going to cover? What is our automation not going to cover? And as a result of that, what are we communicating out? It allows us, if we're following this method and if we're documenting, what is going to be in scope or out of scope. And this is whether we're doing it at the UI level, at the API level, even down to the integration level. It allows us to be able to be very clear and make it very obvious what it is that we're actually testing and what it is that we aren't testing. And in a good portion, this is, in a certain sense, this is a great CYA tool to make sure that you are covered appropriately. So when someone comes back and says, hey, why didn't automation catch X, Y, and Z? You can say, well, that fell under our won't, because usability is not something that we want to be looking for. It's got a very poor ROI. A return on investment. I would have spent months doing this when I could have a manual tester and have a much better feel. Or, it would have taken us 3 weeks in order to verify all of these images through automation, but a manual tester could do it in about 2 minutes. So it allows you to help drive the purpose of your tests and be very specific and poignant about what it is that they're actually looking for. And again, I like to take this back to how it is we're writing our tests and what it is that we're testing, what it is we're writing our tests. Because again, if we're not testing the right things, if we're expressing our tests the wrong way, then everything else that we build on top of it, all the tools that we use, all the frameworks that we use, everything else is going to have a very hard time proving that our tests are working properly if we don't start off with the right basics, if we don't really start off the right way. And so really, to get further into that, I always like to think of my automated tests. I always like to write them in the same fashion that I would actually write my unit tests. And I love the fact, Jeff, that you brought up unit tests earlier, and what I call those unit checks or unit tests. And again, as a whole, they absolutely can describe my system. But individually, I like them to be extremely specific. Now, I don't know how many developers I have on here versus testers or everyone else. But typically, when I bring these up, I like to talk about development practices for the main reason of the fact that people have been writing software for a lot longer, or maybe not a lot, but longer than people have been traditionally testing software. So they've had a lot more time to evolve a lot of these techniques, a lot of their patterns, And so why not let testers actually pick up, reuse these patterns, because there are things that have been proven to work very efficiently and very effectively. So why don't we actually reuse these? And so one of the things, Jeff, that you mentioned earlier in the discussion is testing absolutely everything along the way. So while that can be effective, I actually find that can be also very detrimental to the test automation practice. I like to make sure that I'm checking one thing in my particular test, because as soon as I say that I'm checking everything and I'm looking at everything along the way, what I'm doing is that I'm potentially introducing ambiguity, because then at the end of the day I say, well, I have one test and it tests the homepage, or it tests these 15 different things about the homepage, and if I add in something else, well, really, how specific can I be? But if I have 15 different tests and they each test one individual thing, 15 different checks, I can now say that I actually have one overall test suite, or one test, in a sense, of the homepage that looks at all these 15 different areas, really being able to be very specific. That can be really, really helpful, because if one of my automated tests then fails, I know exactly why, and I know exactly where to pinpoint and what to go after when there is actually an issue. There's no sort of question of, oh, where am I going to go? What am I going to look at? How am I going to debug this? It's, the problem was the text wasn't properly aligned, because that's the test that failed. So I know exactly what it is that I either need to look at, bad test, or which developer to go ping. It's not a, there's a problem on the homepage. That ultimately doesn't help. And when we're trying to do risk assessments based on our automation, that doesn't help either. So I've listed up a few other things on there. The other really important one that I like to talk about is arrange, act, assert, AAA. This should be a very common idea for testers. I don't think this should be really mind-blowing to anyone in and of itself. The idea of get your system in a known state, arrange it, change your system, act on it, and then ensure that the expected outcome is actually achieved, assert. This is a very common unit testing practice, arrange, act, assert. And whether we're doing this consciously or not, this should be something that we're doing as testers. And in automation, it's even more important, because if we don't first do the arrange, if we don't first know that our system is in a good known state, it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to write a good assertion at the end of the day that knows exactly where we end up. Because if you don't know where you start, how can you ever predict where you end? Whereas for manual testers, it's a much easier thing. I don't need to put AI into my actual tests in order to have them try and figure out where they're going to end. That's a very painful thing to do. But I can figure out, oh, well, my user started out, the age 35. So if increment is aged by 1, he'll be 36. Well, oh, wait, this time he's already 36, so I'm incremented one more. Now he's going to be 37. That's fine. If my automated test doesn't know exactly where he is, I have to put in a lot more logic for it to figure out. So that's why I really like the arrange, act, assert pattern. Interdependencies is a huge thing that you really want to limit. It's a huge practice that I've seen over and over with test automation people, which is let's run test B after test A is finished and it's dependent on it. And I mean, I could have Jeff, if you were to let me talk for an hour, I could talk an entire hour about interdependencies, which I know you won't actually let me do here today. But it's something that I would really strongly suggest not to do, because if test A fails, well, what about test B? Are you going to run it? If you don't run it, how do we know if it actually works or not? Well, if you do run it, if it passes, do we actually trust the pass? Because A was a failure. If it fails, does that actually mean anything? Again, because A failed. So just things to be thinking about. How much can you really trust? How much can you really have confidence in these tests? And of course, conditional logic. The more complex you make your automated tests, the more fragile they will become. And this is it. I always like to ask developers this question. Would you put in a giant switch statement in your unit test saying if this condition verified, this condition verified? No, they would write a different test for every single one of those conditions. Why don't you do the exact same thing with your automated test? Why is it that you're checking for 40 or 50 different, 4 or 5 different scenarios or areas with this one particular set? So again, just a lot of things to think about. By writing our tests the right way, we can definitely ensure that we're going to be getting good results and very clear results, which means that we can publish exactly what it is that we're actually trying to accomplish appropriately. So that, I want to move on to a wonderful example, because I have no idea if you guys write code, period, or if you like Java or .NET or Perl or Python or whatever it is. I decided for some of our examples today, we're going to go with Gherkin. So for those of you not familiar with Gherkin, Gherkin is our behavior-driven development, behavior-driven development language. Focuses on the given, the when, the then. Get your system in a known state with my given, perform or arrange, perform some sort of change on the system is my when, so act, and then make some sort of assertion. So assert, that's my then. I can have multiple givens if I want. Ideally, I only do one action, and then I have one verification that I'm looking at. Because as soon as I have more than one action, what is it that I'm really checking? Am I checking the first action or the second action? Why shouldn't I have a check? Why shouldn't I have an assertion for every single action that I'm actually making in order to make sure that my test actually works properly? So again, we have a nice straightforward test that so far is following every single thing that I've talked about. We're only looking at one thing. We're only performing one action. We have everything set up. It should be very clear that we know all we're doing is verifying that my age is properly updated. I'm not looking at anything else on the test, on our page. So it should be, really clear, very straightforward for our test, right? Okay. I mean, clearly not, because otherwise, it'd be a fairly boring example, and really, why am I talking to you guys? So let's go ahead and let's actually log in. So we're going to go to our fantastic site, and we're going to log into our site. So we're going to type in our username, we're going to type in our password, and click the login button. We're going to be taken to a profile. All of this, in this particular example, I don't care how it happened. None of these things are under test in our automated test. Now, if I was a manual tester and I noticed any sort of things, I should be reporting bugs. But for this case, I don't care how we got here for automation. I don't care if we go through the UI. I don't care if I made some API calls and then it spit me back a particular token or a cookie that I were to shove into my site. I don't care if I had a Docker container that I spun up and I opened the browser and I was already logged in and had all the magic done for me. In this case, the only thing that I actually care about is updating my age. So I've clicked on my edit button, and now here's the first action that I'm really interested in, is editing my age. So I'm going to go in. Instead of being 34, I'm going to update my age to 35. I'm going to click Save, and lo and behold, that's unfortunate. I'm going to have to open a bug because my age did not get appropriately updated. It got wiped out. So great. So I have a failing test, and I actually found a bug within here, which is fantastic. So I'm really excited until I go back and I look at my automated test, and I realize that we've run into some sort of problem. I logged into my site, I updated my age, and then 35 is shown. And lo and behold, 35 happens to be part of my particular number, so it's shown on the screen. Well, here, unfortunately, what we've done is we have just destroyed any real confidence that we actually had in our test, because we all saw that there's a bug in the application, but our test passed. And in my mind, this is actually one of the absolute worst things that you can do in testing. You have just said that something passes when it doesn't, which means you've hidden a bug. Whether you want to call this a false positive or a false negative, whether you're coming from the security realm or the testing realm, what you've done is you've just said that I have a test and verified this functionality, but in reality, that's not actually the case. And so why is this so bad? Well, let's say I have 10,000 tests and all of them passed. I've just found that one of them didn't actually pass. So my manager is going to come down to me and say, hey, of those 10,000 and one of them failed, how do I know the other 9,999 weren't also garbage tests like this as well? How do I know you didn't mess up other things? So yeah, that's a huge problem. What is it that we can actually do about it? Because so far I've followed all the right principles and all the right practices that we've just talked about. That I'm limiting the scope of my testing. I'm being very clear as to what I'm looking at. I'm only performing one action. I'm only performing one assert, and yet I've still managed to write myself a terrible test. So the answer to that, again, I'm going to go back and say, well, developers have, again, been around for a while, and they have this fantastic thing called mutation testing. The idea behind mutation testing is you take your test that should pass, you modify the action that you're performing ever so slightly to force a failure, and then you rerun your test. And if the end result is your test still passes, what you just found out is you don't actually have a valid test, because you should be expecting a failure. It doesn't fail, and therefore you're not actually looking at the outcome of the action that you expected. You're looking at something else. We're looking at that phone number instead of the age. And again, that test that we were just looking at, of course, you may have looked at it and immediately said, oh, well, I know that's a problem because you just said shown. I would have used the particular ID or the particular area in there. But, well, let's say that for our UI, developers messed up the ID and they swapped the ID with something else. Maybe they changed the ID and you're not yet aware of it. The mutation testing can add a lot of credibility to your tests so that when you say something passes, you can say, also, when I want it to fail, it does fail. And there's a huge amount of value that can actually be added into that. So we can very easily modify this test and say, all right, well, given I have logged into my site, when I update my age to 30, then 35 is thrown. And now I know immediately, well, if I updated to 30, 35 should not be shown. 30 should be shown. So if I run through my test again, and I still see a pass, I say, aha, great, this is a bad test. I know that there is some sort of problem with it because I'm still getting a pass even though I've tried to force my test to fail. There are lots of tools that are actually out there in this particular space that can do this. For Gherkin, I haven't actually found anything that I really like, but there are great ones for Java, for .NET, for Python, that I definitely would encourage you guys to go look up. My favorite thing to actually do for Gherkin is, well, just wipe out the when. Take out all of your whens and see if your then still actually passed. Because if you do no actions and you still end up with the expected result, then my question would be, what are you actually doing to the system? What is it that you're actually verifying? And again, by that, we can have a lot of confidence in what it is that we're actually trying to verify and what it is that we're actually trying to look at. So that was a really simplistic example. I do want to go through one more, a little bit more complex one before we hop into our next discussion. So let's try something a little bit more difficult. Given I've navigated to my site, when I log in with a bad username password, then I don't see my home page. So that makes sense. Of course, if I have bad credentials, I shouldn't be able to log in. So again, we go to our fantastic site, type in my username, put in my password, and this time, if you remember from last time, it was like 4 or 5 characters. This time, I'm only entering 1. Hit the login button, I go to my loading page, and then, ooh, that's a problem. It took a little while, but the page did actually load. So maybe I didn't have the authentication mechanism set up in my site properly. Maybe the feature wasn't completed. Maybe there was some sort of bug in it. Who knows what? But unfortunately, I go back to my automated test and I see it pass. I go, how is that possible? Here we go. So that loading page was showing for maybe a split second. And my automated test said, well, see, the loading page was what I saw. And so clearly I didn't see the home page. I saw the loading page, so we know that we're all good. Something passed. Again, a manual tester would have no problem picking this out. But an automated test may actually struggle with it. And even though, again, I followed all those best principles and practices we just talked about, I still managed to write myself a bad test. So we could correct this, we could catch this, relatively simply, by just saying, well, instead of running this with a bad username and password, what happens if I run it with a good username and password? Then this should definitely fail. But of course, again, we may get that loading page. And this is one of the more complex, one of those trickier tests, because of course, when we actually get into this, this may only happen 1 out of every 10 times, 1 out of every 50 times. And that becomes even more problematic because mutation testing might catch it, it might not. And this is then when I enter into the realm that I am constantly pushing back on my particular testers on. And if you ever have an automated test fail, and they say, oh, well, I'm just going to rerun it again, you have a problem because why did that test fail? You've either hidden an intermittent bug in your test, you've hidden an intermittent bug with the application, you've hidden an intermittent bug with your framework. Something is causing it to fail at least once, and you need to figure out exactly why, because it's the best way to hide and to run and to obscure potential issues either with your software or with your company's the software that you actually are trying to test. So again, the main takeaways from this that you really want to be thinking about: make sure that you have your goals very clearly defined and established. Make sure that you are in fact testing the correct things. Make sure you're following good principles, good practices, good processes. Make sure that you validate your tests. Make sure you're not writing garbage tests, that what it is that you're actually producing has value and is going to produce the results and always produce the results that you actually want, that you actually expect. And finally, of course, you need to make sure that you're maintaining your tests, that you're continuing to run them, that they're not just kept in a bubble off somewhere, because things do change, systems do change, and it's not often enough to just validate the tests once. Sometimes you need to validate them multiple times to make sure that system changes haven't just invalidated all of your particular tests. So Jeff, I know you wanted to have a little bit of discussion about some of those last fun topics we were just chatting about.
Yeah, awesome stuff, Max. So I don't know if you know, but my last company, we were the first to commercialize mutation testing. put out a commercial version of a mutation testing tool in about, I don't know, 1994. So it was about 20 years too early. But I actually know a lot about mutation testing, and I really love it. And I'm really happy that it is getting a lot of play now, because this idea of validating the confidence of your tests, like how good are your tests, is something that is really important, as you mentioned, to testing in general. Because if we write bad tests, we're going to get bad results. So a couple questions for you. I was just some things I jotted down as you were talking. I do love the mutation testing. You mentioned tools. You haven't found a good one for Gherkin. I love the idea of taking your when out. That was really cool. What are some tools for other languages? Do you have any off the top of your head you could recommend, or you could point people toward? Or maybe we could follow up after this with that. Do you have some to give the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one of my favorite mutation testing tools is actually PyTest. It actually works really well at I'm blanking right now. I think PyTest is for Python. It does a great job of actually taking any statements that you have within your, it's designed for a unit testing framework, but what that means is any sort of automation framework that you have probably runs in some sort of XUnit style thing. I mean, it's very common, for example, for our Selenium tests to run in JUnit or TestNG if you're thinking on the Java space. But it takes this testing framework and it converts all of your asserts. All it does is says if you have an assert true, it's going to do an assert false. If you have an assert equals, it is going to mess up the expected result. It's just going to change it to something else. And it does a really great job of again, verifying everything. There are a few other ones that I really like. There is MuJava. There's Mutate. There's Ninja Turtles. I think it's something mutation testing. I'm blanking on exactly what it is. I think the actual term for it is Ninja Turtles, though. There's Jester, which is really well. It's another tool for Java. I've used Heckle really briefly for Ruby. But there are a lot of fantastic tools that are out there that can help. And it really depends on the language that you're using in the test. Some of them are more geared towards the unit level because I don't know. You said you help commercialize a lot of this mutation testing, and I think there's actually not a lot of talk around mutation testing now in the developer space, and definitely not a lot around the testing space. Value that can really be added to it. That
and it's so
really,
easy to
again,
add.
It's almost
too.
a shame just to ignore this.
It's so easy to add too. I mean, PyTest. I actually think PyTest is for Java because I know we've integrated it into our CI builds on some of our projects. And it's so easy to integrate in, and it runs as a side effect of the rest of your testing. So it's not even like you have to do a lot of work to get some interesting results on the quality of your tests. So that's cool.
Yeah, exactly. It's something, right, that you can just throw into your Jenkins file or throw into your pipeline. And that was why I kind of suggested just wipe out the whens. I was able to accomplish that with one line in sed, which just run all my tests, make sure they all pass, one line in sed, rerun them all, make sure they all fail. I mean, it's a fairly straightforward thing to accomplish.
Okay. Another question was, you were talking about the kind of, arrange, act, assert. I really love the idea of keeping your tests independent just to make it easier to run, and also so they're not, related to one another and failures don't, kill other tests. How do you deal with end-to-end tests in that scenario? Do you rewrite them, or do you try to string together individual tests to do more end-to-end stuff? If you decide to do a smoke test, for instance, end-to-end, do you try to combine individual checks into a longer running test in certain situations, or is that, in your opinion, a no-no, and you should write something specifically for the end-to-end capability you're trying to test?
So I definitely like to shy away from end-to-end tests as much as I can in the automation space, and that's really for three reasons. One, that they become they become very brittle, and they're very hard to maintain, because if one thing changes, and you may not know exactly which step you have to update, whereas if you have individual tests that check each of these steps along the way, it's very obvious as to what needs to get changed, what needs to get updated. The other issue with your end-to-end tests is if something fails early on, you have no idea if the end result is actually going to be passing or not. And so you can get a lot of churn. For these long end-to-end tests, if you run your test, you fail in the first step, great. I'm going to open a bug on the first step. I'm going to send it back to the devs. They're going to fix it, come back to me. Then I'm going to get to the second step that fails. Well, great. I have to send that back to the devs. And so instead of having this one cycle, this one small cycle where I can identify 50 bugs, I have to have 50 different cycles of this. All of that said, so what I like to do when I have end-to-end tests is keep them. Oh, excuse me. And my third point as to why I don't like them is the fact that a lot of times they really lengthen the time of your pipeline and lengthen the amount of time it takes you to test your system. Because what you can do is, well, if I'm have all these small individual tests, I can run them all in parallel, especially if there's no interdependencies like I was just talking about, which means instead of having to wait 10 minutes in order for this one long test to pass, maybe I only have to wait 1 minute if I can get all 10 of these to run in parallel. So when I do want my end-to-end test, what I typically do is I will have, yes, I will do those, but I try and run them completely separate. Those I try and run more as my, in my CD process, things where time isn't quite as much of an issue, and always when I've already made sure that all the individual components work properly. That way, if there's an issue, I know that it's more in the integration side of things, if you'll use that term, versus the individual checks that I did along the line. The same way of how you have unit tests and integration tests. Let's check the individual components and let's make sure that they all work together. I like to keep my automation tests, my functional tests, fairly similar. Let's look at all these individual checks and then let's make sure they all work together, but let's make sure they first work independently before I bother even trying to chain them together to get some sort of verification out of it.
Cool. So let's, we've got a few minutes left. I want to make sure we leave time for questions. A real quick poll, and some already started to fill this out. But when your automated tests fail, how often is it because of your tests? What's your opinion, audience? Does that never happen where your tests are the bug? Or is it seldom? Is it frequent? Almost always? Where are you in terms of, I'd say, the quality of your tests? Give people a few minutes to respond.
Yeah, well, and this is, one of the things that I run into, all the time is we have failing tests, and not a big portion of our time, but a fairly important activity that we have is always about triage. It's all right, great. Yeah. We ran 1,000 tests, 10 of them failed. Let's go ahead and do triage. And one of the things that I always talk to my team about is triage is not about fixing everything. Triage is about going through, identifying what the failures were, why we had failures, opening up bugs, and then let's go ahead and address the bugs. I mean, those really should be two separate activities. Is it a problem on the test side, like we're talking about, or is it a problem with the application? And
or the environment.
I want to know. Exactly. I mean, there's all sorts of different things you'd be looking at. Personally, I'm impressed with our one never that we have for never had any issues with our automated tests. I mean, I would say that's fantastic. I definitely can't claim that. I would say I'm more towards the seldom, but potentially even a little bit more than that. And that's just because oftentimes it's an issue with my test because, well, we had requirements changes and maybe we weren't keeping up to date with them. Maybe we weren't able to, make updates in our tests as quickly as we needed to. Sometimes I've definitely said it's an issue with the application and someone said, no, here's this new requirement. It's definitely an issue with your test. How'd you miss that? And those sort of things happen as well, but it still means it's an issue with my test. It is not an issue with the actual application. And then, of course, there's the fun middle ground of, oh, well, someone told me to fix it. Just change it. I'm confident this is the way it should work, where, you actually have to then try and chase down some sort of requirements. But it looks like, we're between seldom and frequent for,
50,
how often we find issues in our tests. Yeah, really almost 50-50.
That's probably pretty typical. Let's open it up to questions now, other things people have. And while we do that, we skipped up front the poll on who's on the call in terms of roles. So I'm going to reopen that poll while we take questions from the audience. If you could just, what's really your major role in the organization? What is that role? Let's do that survey as we take questions.
We have a question from Pam. Where do you think it's best to start your test automation efforts?
So Pam, that is a great. So the first thing that I would ask is kind of, do you have any sort of test plan in place? What do you already have what sort of testing materials do you already have? If you're starting from scratch, if you actually start testing the exact same time that people start developing, that's fantastic. Unfortunately, for the most part, that's not usually the case. So where I usually like to start my testing automation effort is in one of two places. The first is if you can get integrated in with the Scrum team, and hopefully if you're doing good Agile, if you're doing Agile, you will be integrated in with that team. Start understanding what stories they are. Start planning out some of the tests within the actual sprints, and be asking the questions that you need to know in order to start doing the automation. So if they're working on a new feature, say, well, great, what APIs exist for this feature? So you can start doing some automation there. Well, what's that UI going to look like? Do I have any locators that I can do for that? And when they say no, start asking more questions, try and get that. Because you definitely can do automation in sprints. But I think if you haven't done automation before, it can be a little bit challenging. And a lot of times automation starts to lag behind a few sprints. So it's a great place to start. Another place that I oftentimes tell people to...
I was just going to say, would you agree that if you have the ability to influence the team, that it's pretty critical to get unit testing being performed effectively by developers as part of getting started with automation? What do you think about unit tests?
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, that's one of the things that I typically gloss over when I think about automation testing. But unit tests, of course, they are automated tests, and they're a really important part of it. And unfortunately, I usually gloss over them because, in my mind, well, they're the developer's problem. But they really aren't. They really lead to overall quality, which is what we're looking for. And there's really no reason that we shouldn't be making sure that, first and foremost, we have unit tests. And so, yeah, absolutely. If you have any sort of influence, if you can push for that, that's great. The problem is a lot of times is if there is no unit testing, or if they're not really unit tests, you may not be able to kind of encourage and to get that sort of change. And so you need to start testing at the system or at the more functional level, unfortunately. And when that happens, again, it's about finding out as much as you can about the feature. And the other way that I usually like to do it is you can also go in the opposite direction, which is start looking at the bugs that are actually open. And based on the bugs that you actually have, what you can actually do is start creating automation around the open bugs. And don't allow those bugs to close until you have an automated test that actually passes. And what you're actually doing in this fashion is you're looking at the weakest part of the system and making sure that you're strengthening it. It's the idea of making sure that you don't have any more of those weakest links. Because whether developers like it when I tell them this or not, it's so frequent that I find these same areas breaking again and again because of some changes, because it's just bad code or it's reused code or it's contested code, and making sure that the same bugs don't get reopened. We have this sort of regression that we can start to build off of defects or off of open bugs can give you a very good base to actually build from.
You mentioned regression. I'm assuming you're a big advocate for automating your regression testing so it fits into your CI/CD process. You're not going to try to do regression by hand, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, I don't think I was 100% clear on that. When I pulled up the slide about testing being cumulative, I mean, that's exactly why you have to automate your regression, is the fact that your test set is going to grow and grow and grow over time. And if you don't have automation to help alleviate the burden of that, sure, maybe the first time you can get it done in a day. Second sprint may take you 2. And by sprint 20, it's going to take you 20 days, and that's just not feasible. You need some way in order to do that. And really, automation is that way. It is, I think, the only way that you can really accomplish it effectively and at a cost that makes sense. So,
great,
Lindsay, I saw Lindsay had a question about mutation testing for .NET. So the Ninja Turtles tool that I mentioned is actually .NET and Visual Basic mutation testing tool.
That's great. For those that are interested in continuing the conversation, Alexa, you want to put up the QR code? So we recently started a hub, which is a Slack-based discussion and community that allows us to continue conversations beyond the various conferences that TechWell does, the various training classes that Coveros does, and things like this. if you click your phone on the QR code, or you just go to hub.techwell.com, the channel is test_automation. Max and I are going to be monitoring that, and if there are additional questions we didn't get a chance to answer, or you want to continue the conversation about confidence in your tests, mutation testing, anything we've talked about here, definitely go to the hub and we'll continue the conversation there. Yep. Well, it looks like we're out of time. Thanks everybody for participating. Hope this was informative and helpful. And as Alexa mentioned, she will be sending a follow-up email with information on the recording and also where you can download the information if you missed it up front, the presentation. Alexa, back to you.
Thank you, and have a good afternoon and a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Great. Take care.
Thanks,